Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture 23 of web design and development, and in this lecture I'm going to discuss about input collection, form the forms, and validation on those input collections. So here are the lecture contents, and in this lecture we are going to start about input requests and rules about the inputs. And there will be some discussion about input collection and storing them into the databases, and finally I will discuss about the input validation and putting guards on the fields to minimize the data errors. So let's start with the input requests. Input requests are the requests that we send from the browser to the server from the input forms. So web applications use a variety of ways to collect, validate, normalize, and filter that user-provided data which you provide from the browser using the input form. These forms send requests from the browser to the server or from the client to the server. The most common way is to use the form request object. So you can use the illuminate slash http slash request to create a request object in any of your controller, and then you can get the input from the request by accessing the request object and fetching the name of the input. For example, if we take the example which we discussed in last few lectures about the banking app, we had one field in the form called country, and we can access the field of the country or the value of the country using this statement. The input requests provide a number of methods to collect input in a variety of ways. For example, request all method provides an array containing all the inputs provided by user in a form. Similarly, request accept method works much like the above, but here you can exclude one or more fields specifying the name of this field in the accept method, and input will only request method will only provide you input except those provided in the method. Request only method works in the inverse of the request, and you can only access the request uh, fields by specifying the name in the only field. Request has method is a very useful method, and it is used quite often. It can check whether a particular piece of input is available or not that user has submitted the form with empty inputs. Similarly, a request input method provides a way to access any single input. So it has two parameters. The second one is being the default value if the input is not provided by the user. Request method can provide the HTTP method of the request. For example, if you are sending a get, post, or put request or delete request, it is a useful method to get the HTTP method from the request. You can also check whether the request method matches the defined verb using a request is method and specifying the name of the HTTP method. So array input can also be processed in the forms in the web forms. For example, if you provide an input element with the type text and the name as employee 0 first, you can access the same in the server side using the first name and request object and accessing the input method or by specifying the name of the field. The array input method is also capable to receive input in the JSON form, which makes it very powerful using the dot method. However, if the post does not have application/JSON headers, the input method will not be able to intercept the interpret the JSON request. The request JSON will parse the input without considering the headers into JSON. So here is an example of getting the input from the user. So if you use the last example we created in the last few lectures regarding the bank app example, the additional thing you have to do is to create a new view containing the form inputs. So this text or this code shows a form uh, described here, and it has the same fields that we discussed in the last lectures. It has a bank name and a text field, it has an amount and a text field, it has a bank entry and a text field, and it has a type input method to submit. So the important consideration here is that we have to submit data to the server. So the HTTP method will be HTTP post method. So name of the method for the form is post, and we have to specify the action to run on the server, that is our root on the server. So we provide the action is /interest, that means from the location we are currently in the browser, we will post this method to the /interest root. So here is a field uh, CSRF. So it is a field to limit the cross site or SQL injection attacks. We will discuss more about the CSRF field in the upcoming lectures. So next is a tabular layout, and it has a label bank name, and it has a input type text, and the name of the field is bank underscore name. Similarly, we have amount, and again name of the field is also amount. We have a country, and the name of field is country, and finally we have a input button, and type is equal to submit. So once you have done with the providing input, you can store this input at the server. So if you have created a resource controller in the last lecture, you must have been provided with the store function in the uh, bank app controller or interest controller. The store method of the resource controller in the bank interest is used to create new entries into the database. So if your database is set in the environment and config database.php file, this method uses the input request to get input from the form and then post this request input to the database server. So when we created the illuminate slash request object, we can pass this object into the store method using the request and $request object. So we can create a new interest into the database by providing a object of a bank interest and setting its create method, and we are setting the values of its attributes bank name, amount, country, and user ID. So if you recall from the last lectures where we created the database migrations, we had the similar fields in the database. So we get the bank name from the request dot bank name, we get the amount from the request amount, and we get the country from the request country. That is all the three inputs from the user. So for the current time, we set the user ID is equal to 1, so we do not have to worry about which user is submitting the input. However, we can use any of the logged in user input, which will be discussed in the next few lectures. So once you create this new field, a new record in the database, the next thing is to return or redirect this same URL so that your URL is passed back to the same location with some message. So that was the one way to get the input from the user. The input can also be taken from the user from the roots. So URL is all as much as the user data than anything else. There are two primary ways to get input from the URL. So one way is to get from the request, that whenever the user sends the request, you can extract the information from the user roots. And the second option is to from the root parameters, that user provides the number of parameters from the request and root, and you can get extract those parameters. The request above contains two segments. For example, if you consider the first case, it has two segments, users and 15. The input from the URL segment can be extracted using the method request segments, and it will be array, or using the request segment and providing the segment ID using the one based index for each segment. So for example, if you want to get the element 15, that will be on the location 2. The second way is to access the input from the URL using the root parameters. For example, if you specified the root using the root get method and specified the user slash ID in the curly braces, which is an optional parameter, and whenever provided, the input will be received in a $sign ID variable, and if it is not provided, the $sign ID variable will be null. So the next step is to validate the input which you have collected from the user. So input validation is one of the non-trivial tasks in web application development, and it is done at every stage, at the client side, at the server side, and at the database level. So input can be validated at several stages. First of all, you can do it into the HTML elements to validate the input. Then you can use the JavaScript to validate the input. And finally, you can use the server-side script to validate the input. The first two steps have been seen in the first part of the lectures. That means you can do it by setting a typical type of field. For example, if you want to validate the email or numbers, you can use specific type of input elements. Laravel also provides quite a few ways to validate the input. So the request object has the validate method that provides a convenient shortcut for the most common validation workflow. For example, if you want to create a request, if you want to validate a request, you can use the request validate method, and you can set the number of validations in the same case. For example, you can use that bank name is a required field, and it has a maximum length of 48, and amount is also required. So whenever you submit a request from the client to the server, the request will validate these two objects, and if the validation fails, the further processing is abandoned, and the user is directed back to uh, fill the required fields. There are a number of other methods, but we do not have enough space to cover every possible validation will here. So here are a few simple methods to validate the input into the form. So one of you have seen is the required attribute and required if attribute. So which is used whenever you have to fill in the information necessarily. Similarly, field can contain typical type of characters. For example, you can use alpha, alpha dash, alphanumeric, etc., or simply integers. Field must contain certain patterns. You can specify that it must contain email, active URL, or internet protocol IP address. You can also set different validation on dates, that you have to specify date after some date and before some date, etc. You can also set on numbers, image dimensions, and databases, etc. If the automatic validation does not work for you, you can create your own manual validation. A manual validator can be used using the validator facade. For example, if you use the same example as we're doing in this lecture, you can create a validator for the storing input into the database. This can be done using the validator make method and requesting all the inputs and specifying the same input attribute. So you check first condition that if validator fails, you return the same URL back with the input errors which will be provided by the validators, and you also send with the input so that these inputs will be filled again into the input form. So if the validator does not fail, you proceed to the storing elements into the databases. So you can also display when you return the fields from the validations, you can display it onto the error fields. So if there is no validation rule available, the custom rules can be created in the app/rules/rules.php using the two methods, and the methods are passes and messages. The validate method on the request with the errors method flashes error messages to the session variable. So whenever the session is active, you can access those messages. The error messages are available in the $ error variable, and which is present in the views. So you can use if $errors have any messages, then you can loop on these messages and display each error, such as described in this example. So that I submitted the form with no inputs, and we have two uh, validators. First one, the bank name field is required, and second one, the amount field is required. So if I have provided a field of bank name with more than 48 characters, it must have been given me a different error that field name must not be greater than 48 characters. Another way to protect your data is to implement some guards on your data. So input data can also be filtered at the model level. So guards are provided at the model level. So if the user is malicious and tries the input the field we do not require, for example, if we use a simple application just like this, and user provided a custom user ID so that claiming that he is someone else and hiding his identity, for example posting a comment and passing the user ID of someone else, that's posting a comment anonymously or posting a comment on someone else's behalf. The database eloquent mass assignment provides two attributes on the fields. Field can be filled using the $fillable variable, and field cannot be filled using $guarded variable. So any field you want to have from the system provided, you can use is that as a protected $guarded, and provide the number of input fields as a guarded element, so that the user will not be able to provide these input fields with the form submission request, and the following fields will be accessible to the user and user can fill these fields. So anytime you display the content on the web page that was created by the user, you have to guard against a malicious input such as a script injection. For example, in a scenario where user can post on a page, you do not want them to post a malicious JavaScript request that will run on the user browser. So you have to escape the user input to show that the page to avoid such scenarios. So this can be done in a number of ways. The Laravel covers this using the blade template, using the default echo as double curly braces, and providing the name of the variable. So this will convert the code into the JavaScript format. Additionally, you can use the extra word to avoid escaping output. For example, you can use the similar example as here to avoid certain JavaScript attacks. So that is end about the input validation, and if you want to read more about the topic, you can look into the chapter number 7 of the recommended book, or you can ask me any questions. Thank you very much.